The moment I realized my daughter-in-law had erased me from my own grandson's birthday party was the moment everything in our family finally made sense. I arrived 10 minutes early, the way I always did for family events, carrying a neatly wrapped box with bright blue paper and a silver ribbon I had picked out the day before. My grandson Lucas was turning 8, and birthdays had always mattered in our family. When my husband Robert was still alive, we used to say that a child's birthday was the one day each year the whole family should feel united, laughing together over cake and ice cream. Even after Robert passed 3 years ago, I kept that tradition close to my heart. The party was being held in Daniel and Emily's backyard, about 15 minutes from my house in Cedar Ridge. As I walked through the wooden gate, the late afternoon sun was still warm on my shoulders, and the smell of grilled burgers drifted through the air. Colorful balloons were tied to the fence. A long folding table stood near the patio, covered with a bright red tablecloth and paper plates decorated with cartoon rockets. Children ran across the grass with plastic swords, shouting and laughing, while a Bluetooth speaker played cheerful pop music from somewhere near the deck. For a moment, everything looked exactly the way a family celebration should look. I smiled and stepped further into the yard, scanning the table for a place to sit. That's when I noticed something strange. There were chairs lined up neatly around the table. One for Daniel, one for Emily, several for their friends. Even 2 smaller chairs placed carefully for Lucas and his best friend Tyler. But there was no seat for me. At first I thought I must have overlooked it. I counted again, slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The number of chairs matched the number of guests perfectly, except for one person, me. I stood there for a moment, still holding Lucas's gift in both hands, trying to make sense of it. Maybe another chair was inside the house. Maybe they were still setting up. It wouldn't be the first time a party started a little chaotically. Just then, Emily walked over from the patio, carrying a tray of lemonade glasses. She wore a bright summer dress, and that perfectly polished smile she used whenever other people were watching. Her eyes flicked toward the table, then back to me. She noticed immediately that I was looking for a place to sit. "Oh," she said lightly, tilting her head with a small laugh. "Oops, looks like we didn't plan a seat for you." The words were delivered in the same tone someone might use when forgetting an extra napkin. Casual, almost playful. For a second, I waited for her to say something else. Something like, "Don't worry, I'll grab another chair," or "Let me fix that." But she didn't. She simply set the tray down on the table and turned toward another guest who had just walked in through the gate. Karan," Emily called brightly. "I'm so glad you could make it." Around us, the party continued without pause. A group of parents chatted near the grill. Someone laughed loudly at a joke I couldn't hear. Lucas ran past me chasing a balloon, his sneakers thumping against the wooden deck. No one seemed to notice that I was still standing there, holding the present I'd spent half an hour wrapping the night before. I told myself not to take it personally. Maybe it really was just an oversight, but something about the way Emily had said it lingered in my mind. That small, satisfied smile. The way her eyes had quickly scanned the other guests before she spoke. I felt a quiet heaviness settle in my chest, the kind that doesn't come from a single moment, but from many moments finally lining up. Because standing there in that sunny backyard, watching everyone else comfortably take their seats, I began to realize something that had been slowly forming in the back of my mind for years. This missing chair wasn't an accident. It was simply the first time a message had been delivered so clearly that I could no longer pretend not to see it. For a moment, I simply stood there with the present in my hands, watching the empty space where a chair should have been. The music from a speaker kept playing a cheerful song about summer and sunshine, and somewhere near the grill someone opened a soda can with a sharp metallic click. Everything sounded normal. Everything looked normal. But inside me something had shifted quietly, like a door closing somewhere deep in a long hallway. I told myself not to make it awkward. At my age, you learn that sometimes dignity means choosing silence. I adjusted the ribbon on Lucas's gift and stepped a little closer to the table, as if I had only been looking around. Emily was already laughing with Karen, her voice bright and energetic, explaining where the extra plates were and asking if anyone had seen the bag of party hats. She moved easily through the yard like a hostess in complete control of her event. I watched her for a moment, noticing how naturally she filled the space, how confidently she spoke to every guest who arrived. Anyone who did not know our family well would think she had always been the center of it. Daniel stood near the grill with two other fathers from Lucas's school. They were discussing baseball scores and weekend yard projects. My son looked relaxed, one hand resting on the handle of the spatula while he flipped burgers. For a second, his eyes drifted across the yard and landed on me, just briefly, long enough for him to see that I was still standing. Then his gaze moved away again, as if he had remembered something suddenly very important about the conversation he was having. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. Not anger exactly. Something quieter than that. Something older. Lucas ran past again, holding a plastic toy rocket above his head and making loud engine noises. His friends chased him across the grass, their sneakers kicking up small clouds of dust. He stopped when he saw me, and his face lit up. "Grandma Margaret!" he shouted, running over and throwing his arms around my waist. I bent slightly to hug him back, careful not to crush the present between us. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said softly. "I brought you something." His eyes widened immediately the way children's eyes do when they see a wrapped gift. "Is it a rocket?" he asked. I smiled. "You will have to open it to find out." Before he could say anything else, Emily called his name sharply from across the yard. "Lucas, do not forget the guests are arriving. Go greet Tyler and his parents." Lucas looked between us for a moment, torn between curiosity and obedience. Then he nodded and ran off again toward the gate where another family had just walked in. I watched him go, feeling the warmth of his hug fade slowly from my arms. The table was filling now. Guests were beginning to take their seats, pulling chairs out with the scraping sound of metal legs on the patio stones. Plates were being passed around. Someone set a large bowl of potato salad in the middle of the table. Emily moved from chair to chair, checking that everyone had a drink. I remained where I was, just a few feet away, still standing with the gift box in my hands like an extra piece of decoration that had been placed in the wrong spot. A woman I recognized from one of Lucas's soccer games glanced toward me with a polite but uncertain smile. Her eyes moved briefly to the table and then back to me, as if she was trying to solve a puzzle she did not fully understand. I returned the smile gently, so she would not feel uncomfortable. After 72 years on this earth, I had learned that people often notice more than they say. And sometimes the silence of strangers can tell you exactly what everyone else is thinking. The sunlight shifted slightly as a cloud moved across the sky, and the bright balloons tied along the fence fluttered in a soft breeze. It should have been a peaceful moment. Instead, I felt memories beginning to gather quietly in my mind, like old photographs being laid out on a table one by one. The Christmas dinner 2 years ago, when the table had been suddenly too full and I was given a plate in the kitchen. The school recital last spring, when Emily had told me the wrong start time, and I arrived after Lucas had already finished his performance. The family barbecue last summer, when someone joked that I must enjoy watching everyone else eat because I had not been offered a seat then either. Each moment had seemed small at the time, easy to dismiss, easy to forgive. But standing there now, in the middle of my grandson's birthday party, the pattern felt impossible to ignore. I finally set the gift carefully on the edge of the table, making sure it would not fall. Then I folded my hands together in front of me and took a slow breath. Around me, the laughter continued. Forks clinked against paper plates, and the smell of grilled burgers drifted through the warm afternoon air. No one asked if I needed a chair. And after a while, I realized something even more important. Emily had not forgotten to place one. She had simply decided that I did not belong at the table anymore. For several minutes, I remained exactly where I was, standing just beside the long table while everyone else settled comfortably into their chairs. The afternoon sun continued to warm the yard, and the soft breeze carried the smell of charcoal and grilled meat across the patio. Plates were being passed around, drinks were being poured, and conversations overlapped in that familiar rhythm that happens whenever a group of people believes they're sharing a pleasant moment together. From the outside, it probably looked like a perfect birthday celebration. From where I stood, it felt very different. I watched Daniel for a moment longer. He had moved into the role of host now, carrying a tray of burgers from the grill and setting them down near the center of the table. Someone thanked him. Another guest asked if there were vegetarian options, and he laughed politely while explaining that Emily had prepared a separate plate of grilled vegetables. His voice sounded relaxed and friendly, exactly the way it always had when he was trying to make everyone comfortable. I wondered briefly if he remembered that when he was 8 years old, he used to sit beside me at every meal because he said food tasted better when his mother was near. The memory appeared suddenly and clearly, like an old photograph that had been tucked inside a book for many years. Daniel had been a quiet child with thoughtful eyes. He used to follow his father around the yard while Robert fixed fences or repaired the porch steps. When Daniel scraped his knee or lost a baseball game, he would come straight to me because he believed that mothers knew how to fix things that nobody else could fix. Back then, our dinner table had always included one extra chair, just in case a neighbor stopped by or someone needed a place to sit. Robert used to say that a home should never run out of chairs because every chair meant someone was welcome. The memory faded slowly as the sound of laughter from the table brought me back to the present. Emily had taken her seat near the middle, her posture relaxed and confident as she spoke to the guests on both sides of her. She reached across the table to adjust the birthday candles that had been placed next to Lucas's cake. The frosting was bright blue with tiny white stars, and the number 8 stood proudly in the center. Everything had been arranged carefully, everything except a place for me. A man sitting across from Emily glanced toward me again. His name was Mark, one of Daniel's co-workers if I remember correctly. He cleared his throat slightly and looked around the table before speaking. "Do we need another chair?" he asked in a polite but uncertain tone. For a moment, the conversation paused. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, but long enough for several people to follow his gaze in my direction. Emily did not turn immediately. She took a sip of lemonade first, setting the glass down with careful precision before responding. "Oh no," she said lightly. "Margaret prefers to move around. She likes to keep busy during parties." Her voice carried easily across the table, cheerful and casual, as if she were explaining a harmless little habit. A few guests nodded politely, accepting the explanation without question. Mark hesitated for a second, as though he might say something else, but then he simply shrugged and reached for a burger from the tray. The conversation resumed almost instantly. Someone began discussing a road trip to Colorado. Another guest mentioned the rising price of gasoline. Within seconds, the moment had disappeared completely, swallowed by the comfortable noise of people who did not want to interrupt the celebration. I felt an odd calm settle over me. It was not the calm of acceptance. It was the calm that comes when a puzzle finally reveals its picture. I looked around the yard again, taking in the details I had missed earlier. The balloons tied along the fence. The stack of wrapped gifts near the sliding glass door. The paper banner hanging across the patio that read "Happy Birthday, Lucas" in bright red letters. Every decoration had been placed with care. Every detail had been planned. And suddenly I understood something that had taken me far too long to recognize. Exclusion does not always arrive as a loud insult. Sometimes it appears quietly, hidden inside ordinary moments that everyone else pretends not to notice. It arrives in small adjustments to seating charts, in forgotten invitations, in polite explanations that sound reasonable until you hear them often enough to recognize the pattern. I folded my hands together again and watched Lucas climb onto his chair beside Tyler, both boys laughing as they compared the toys they had received. The sound of their excitement was genuine and joyful, and I felt grateful that at least his birthday would remain a happy memory for him. Children should not carry the weight of adult decisions. Emily leaned back in her chair, glancing briefly toward me once more. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. There was no apology in her expression, no surprise either, only a quiet certainty that she had arranged things exactly the way she wanted them. I returned her gaze calmly and gave the smallest nod, almost as if we had just finished a conversation that no one else had heard. Because in that silent exchange, something had become very clear. This was not about a missing chair anymore. It was about understanding exactly where I stood in my own family. For a while, I remained exactly where I was, watching the celebration continue as if nothing unusual had happened. Plates were being filled, glasses clinked gently against the table, and conversations drifted across the warm backyard air. Someone asked Daniel about the new fence he had installed along the side of the property. Another guest complimented Emily on the decorations, saying the rocket theme looked wonderful for an 8-year-old boy. Emily accepted the praise with the same composed smile she used with everyone. She thanked them graciously, explaining that Lucas loved anything related to space and that she had spent days planning the details. I noticed the way she said that word planning. It lingered slightly longer than the others, as if she wanted people to understand how carefully everything had been arranged. I believed her, because when someone plans an event this thoroughly, they do not forget something as simple as one chair. I slowly turned my attention back to the table again. The red tablecloth rippled gently in the breeze. Paper napkins were folded neatly beside every plate. Even the condiments had been placed at equal distances so no one would need to reach too far. Everything about the scene suggested careful preparation. The longer I stood there, the clearer it became that the missing chair had never been a mistake. It had been a decision. That realization did not arrive like anger. It arrived quietly, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for years. I found myself remembering another afternoon long ago when Daniel had been about Lucas's age. Robert and I had hosted a birthday party for him in our own backyard. Back then, the yard had looked different. The maple tree near the fence had been smaller, and Robert had built a wooden picnic table with his own hands so the children would have somewhere sturdy to sit during parties. Daniel had insisted that every child needed their own place at the table. I could still hear his small voice arguing about it with the seriousness that only children possess. He said it would not be fair if anyone had to stand while the others ate cake. Robert had laughed and told him that kindness often begins with small things like making sure everyone has a seat. That memory drifted through my mind while I watched Daniel now, standing comfortably near the table he had set up in his own yard. The boy who once believed so strongly in fairness had grown into a man who avoided looking directly at his mother when she stood alone. I did not blame him entirely. Life changes people in ways that happen slowly, so slowly that sometimes they do not even notice the direction they are moving. I wondered briefly if he realized what had just happened, or if he had convinced himself that it was easier not to see it. Lucas's laughter broke through my thoughts again. He was showing Tyler the toy rocket someone had given him earlier, demonstrating how the small plastic wings could fold outward. The excitement in his voice was bright and genuine, and it reminded me why I had come in the first place. Children should feel surrounded by love on their birthdays. Whatever tension existed between the adults in his life, he deserved a day filled with joy. I watched him carefully for a moment, making sure he had not noticed anything unusual about where I stood. Thankfully, his attention remained entirely focused on the toys and friends around him. Emily leaned forward in her chair and said something to the woman sitting beside her, and both of them laughed softly. Her posture was relaxed, confident, almost satisfied. I realized then that she had probably expected me to react differently. Perhaps she had imagined that I would protest, or ask for a chair, or create an uncomfortable moment in front of the guests. Instead, I had done none of those things. I had simply remained where I was, observing quietly. Sometimes silence unsettles people more than arguments ever could. I picked up the glass of lemonade that had been left on the edge of the patio railing and took a slow sip. The drink was cold and slightly too sweet, but gave my hand something to do. As I stood there, I began to notice something else. A few of the guests were glancing toward me from time to time, their expressions thoughtful. They had heard Emily's explanation earlier. They had accepted it politely. But people are more perceptive than we often assume. Even when they say nothing, they can sense when something does not feel quite right. I wonder how the scene looked from their perspective. A 72-year-old grandmother standing quietly beside the table at her grandson's birthday party while everyone else remained seated. The image spoke for itself without anyone needing to explain it. After another minute, I set the empty glass down and looked around the yard one more time. The decorations, the food, the cheerful banner above the patio door. Everything appeared perfect. Yet perfection has a strange way of revealing the smallest cracks. And standing there in that warm afternoon light, I realized that sometimes the clearest understanding of a situation comes not from what people say, but from the space they choose to leave empty. The longer I stood there, the more the small details of the afternoon began to settle into place in my mind. The children's laughter rose and fell across the yard while the adults continued their conversations around the table. Someone had started telling a story about a camping trip in the mountains, and a few people leaned closer to listen. Emily reached forward to refill a guest glass of lemonade, her movements smooth and practiced, the way someone behaves when they're certain everything is under control. I watched quietly from my place beside the patio railing, and after a while I realized that the discomfort I had felt earlier had begun to fade into something steadier. When you live long enough, you begin to recognize certain moments as turning points even while they are still happening. They arrive quietly, without ceremony, and yet afterward nothing feels quite the same. I turned my attention back to Lucas for a moment. He had climbed halfway out of his chair to show Tyler how the small rocket toy could spin when the button was pressed. The two boys laughed so loudly that several guests turned to look at them. Emily glanced over as well and reminded them to stay seated until everyone had finished eating. Lucas nodded quickly, though the excitement in his face made it clear he was already thinking about cake and presents. Watching him reminded me of another birthday many years ago when Daniel had received a toy train set that Robert and I had saved for months to buy. Daniel had spent the entire afternoon building tracks across the living room floor, while Robert helped him connect the pieces. I had stood in the doorway that day, smiling at the two of them as the train circled again and again, the tiny wheels humming softly along the metal rails. Robert had always believed that family moments were built from small kindnesses repeated over time. He used to say that respect within a family should feel as natural as breathing. The memory lingered only briefly before the present returned around me. Daniel had finally taken a seat at the end of the table, laughing at something one of his coworkers had said. I noticed that he still had not looked in my direction again. Perhaps he was avoiding the situation, or perhaps he had convinced himself that Emily's explanation earlier had been enough. Either way, the result remained the same. I reached for the glass of lemonade again, though it was already empty, and then set it back down on the railing. Across the table, Emily began discussing the upcoming school year with another parent, mentioning how quickly Lucas was growing and how proud she was of his progress in science class. Her voice carried easily through the yard, confident and bright. She looked completely at ease, as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. For a brief moment, our eyes met again. She did not smile this time. Instead, she held my gaze for a second longer than before, and I sensed that she was measuring something silently, perhaps waiting to see whether I would say anything or ask again for a chair. But I did neither. I simply nodded once and turned my attention back toward the yard. That small exchange seemed to end whatever silent test had been taking place between us. Emily returned to her conversation without another glance. I breathed in slowly, noticing how the afternoon air carried the scent of cut grass and charcoal smoke. The breeze moved the edges of the red tablecloth again, lifting it slightly before letting it fall back against the metal legs of the folding table. In that gentle movement, I suddenly remembered the day Robert and I had signed the paperwork for the house Daniel now lived in. It had been almost 20 years ago. Robert had insisted that the property should remain a place where family gathered freely, a home where our children and grandchildren would always feel welcome. I could still see the way he had leaned back in his chair after the meeting with the realtor, satisfied that he had secured a future space for the family he loved. At the time, I had believed that promise would naturally carry forward through the years. Standing there now, I realized how easily promises can change shape when different people begin making the decisions. Around the table, the guests were finishing their meals. Several of them pushed their chairs back slightly, stretching their arms while waiting for cake to be served. One woman glanced toward me again and offered a small, sympathetic smile. I returned it gently, appreciating the kindness, even though she said nothing aloud. After a moment, she looked away again, perhaps uncertain how to address what she had witnessed. I did not blame her. Most people prefer to avoid stepping into situations that belong to someone else's family. I rested my hands lightly on the railing and looked across the yard once more. Balloons moved quietly against the fence. Lucas laughed again with his friends. Emily continued speaking with confident ease, while Daniel nodded along to another conversation. Everything appeared normal to anyone who arrived at that moment. Yet within me something had settled into clarity. Sometimes understanding does not arrive through loud confrontation or dramatic arguments. Sometimes it appears in a quiet afternoon, when you realize that the space someone leaves for you reveals exactly how they see you. And once that understanding takes hold, it becomes impossible to ignore. For several minutes after that realization, I simply stood there and allowed the scene to continue around me without interruption. The adults finished their meals and began stacking their empty plates near the edge of the table, while the children grew louder and more energetic as the moment for cake approached. Lucas jumped out of his chair again and ran across the yard chasing a bright blue balloon that had slipped loose from the fence. Tyler followed him, laughing so hard he nearly tripped over his own sneakers. Their voices carried across the lawn in that clear and carefree way that only children possess. I felt a small sense of relief that Lucas had not noticed anything unusual about where I stood. He was too busy enjoying his birthday to pay attention to adult tensions, and I hoped it would stay that way. The sound of Emily clapping her hands together drew everyone's attention back to the table. "All right, everyone," she said cheerfully. "Let us clear some space for the cake." Several guests stood up to help move plates and cups aside, while she carefully lifted the large blue cake from the center of the table and placed it on a small stand. The candles were already arranged in the shape of the number 8, their thin white sticks waiting to be lit. Daniel reached for a lighter from the counter near the grill and stepped forward to help. For a moment, the whole yard grew quieter as people gathered closer to the table. I noticed that someone had placed a few extra folding chairs near the far end for the children who had wandered away earlier, but none appeared near the spot where I had been standing. The empty space beside the railing remained exactly as it had been since I arrived. I watched the small preparations with calm attention. Emily straightened the cake stand and brushed a few crumbs from the tablecloth with careful fingers. She looked completely focused on the celebration, speaking gently to Lucas as he returned from the yard with flushed cheeks and messy hair. "Come stand here beside me," she told him. "Everyone is ready to sing." Lucas climbed up onto his chair again so that he could see the cake clearly, his eyes bright with anticipation. The guests began gathering closer together, forming a loose circle around the table. Someone lifted a phone to record the moment, while another guest dimmed the patio light slightly so the candle flames would show more clearly. The small yellow flames flickered as Daniel lit each candle one by one. Their warm glow reflected in the shiny blue frosting and made the white stars sparkle softly. As everyone prepared to sing, I took a step back toward the maple tree at the edge of the yard. From there I could see the entire scene without standing directly beside the table. The shade from the tree felt cooler, and the gentle rustling of its leaves softened the sounds of conversation around me. When the first voices began singing Happy Birthday, the familiar melody filled the air. Children's voices mixed with the deeper tones of the adults, creating that slightly uneven chorus that always accompanies family gatherings. Lucas grinned widely as he listened, swaying slightly in his seat while he waited for the final note. I joined the singing quietly from where I stood, my voice blending into the larger sound without drawing attention. In that moment, I realized something important. Even though I was standing apart from the table, the love I felt for my grandson had not changed in the slightest. It remained steady and strong, untouched by the arrangements around it. When the song ended, Lucas leaned forward and blew out the candles with one enthusiastic breath. Cheers and applause followed immediately, and several guests laughed as a thin curl of smoke rose above the cake. Emily clapped proudly, while Daniel placed a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder. Cameras flashed as people captured the moment for their phones. I watched quietly, allowing the joy of the child's celebration to take its rightful place in the afternoon. Yet beneath that warmth, another thought continued forming inside my mind. Standing beneath the maple tree, I realized that the events of the day had given me something valuable. Clarity has a way of arriving when you least expect it, often disguised as a simple moment that others overlook. The missing chair had revealed more than anyone intended. It had shown me exactly how the balance of respect within this family had shifted over time. And once you see something clearly, it becomes impossible to return to the comfortable illusions that once existed. The guests began cutting slices of cake and passing them around the table while the children argued playfully over who would receive the piece with the most frosting. Emily moved through the group, handing out plates with confident efficiency. From where I stood, I could see that the celebration continued smoothly, just as she had planned. Yet inside me, a quiet decision had begun to take shape, one that had nothing to do with cake or chairs or decorations. Sometimes the most important changes begin silently, forming beneath the surface long before anyone else notices them. The cake was passed around slowly, each slice carefully placed on a paper plate with a plastic fork. Children received the largest portions, their faces lighting up at the thick layers of blue frosting. Lucas proudly showed his slice to Tyler before taking his first bite, and the two of them laughed again when the frosting smeared across Lucas's nose. The sound of their laughter carried through the yard like sunlight, warm and uncomplicated. I remained beneath the maple tree, watching the moment unfold from a distance that now felt strangely natural. No one asked why I had not taken a slice of cake yet. No one offered to bring me a plate. The celebration continued smoothly, almost gracefully, as if the afternoon had been rehearsed many times before it ever began. Emily moved easily between guests, making sure everyone had enough cake and drinks. She bent slightly to wipe a small drop of frosting from Lucas's cheek, her voice soft as she reminded him to thank his friends for coming. Daniel stood beside the table holding his own plate of cake, speaking with Mark again about weekend plans and yard work. From where I stood, the entire scene appeared balanced and cheerful. Yet beneath that pleasant surface, I felt the quiet certainty that the balance had shifted long before today. I looked up through the branches of the maple tree above me. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting moving shadows across the grass. The same tree had stood here when Robert and I first visited the property years ago. I remembered the afternoon clearly. Robert had walked across the yard, measuring the distance from the fence to the patio with long, careful steps. He said the tree would be perfect for shade during family gatherings. He imagined children playing beneath it while the adults sat around a table nearby, talking late into the evening. As the sun set behind the hills, Robert always believed that families should grow stronger with each generation. I closed my eyes for a moment and listened to the sounds of the party again. The laughter, the quiet clink of forks against plates, the hum of conversation drifting across the lawn. Somewhere nearby, a car passed slowly along the street, its tires brushing against the gravel at the edge of the driveway. When I opened my eyes again, I noticed something small but meaningful. A little girl from Lucas's class had wandered toward the edge of the yard while eating her cake. She stopped near the maple tree and looked up at me curiously. "Why are you standing here?" she asked in a simple and honest voice. Children often ask questions that adults avoid. "I like the shade," I replied softly. She considered that answer for a moment before nodding as if it made perfect sense. Then she ran back toward the other children without another thought. Her innocence made me smile faintly. The truth was that standing here had begun to feel like the most honest place I could be. At the table, Emily was now organizing the opening of presents. She called Lucas over and cleared a space in front of him so he could see each gift as he opened it. Wrapping paper began to tear as he eagerly unwrapped toy after toy, his excitement growing with each new discovery. Guests clapped politely when he lifted a brightly colored rocket ship from one of the boxes. I noticed when he finally reached the gift I had placed on the table earlier. Lucas held the blue, wrapped box carefully, turning it in his hands as he read the small card attached to the ribbon. His face brightened instantly. "This one is from Grandma Margaret," he announced proudly. For a moment his eyes searched the yard until they found me beneath the tree. He waved excitedly before opening the box. Inside was a small telescope I had chosen after hearing him talk about the stars during our last visit together. Lucas gasped when he saw it. "A real telescope," he shouted, holding it up for everyone to see. Several guests leaned closer with interest. Daniel looked over as well, his expression briefly surprised. Emily forced a polite smile and said something about how Lucas would enjoy looking at the moon. But Lucas was already running toward me across the grass, the telescope still clutched in his hands. "Grandma Margaret, look," he said breathlessly when he reached me. "Now I can see the planets." I knelt slightly so I could meet his eyes. "Yes," I told him quietly. "And the stars too." For a moment he hugged me tightly. The telescope pressed between us. Then he ran back toward the table to show his friends how it worked. As I watched him go, the quiet decision forming inside me grew stronger. Some things in life cannot be forced through arguments or explanations. Respect cannot be demanded where it is no longer freely given. But clarity brings its own kind of strength. And as the afternoon light shifted slowly across the yard, I understood that this moment had revealed exactly what I needed to know about the place I now held within my own family. Lucas spent the next several minutes showing the telescope to every child who would stand still long enough to look through it. The small black tube passed from one set of hands to another, while excited voices filled the yard with questions about planets and stars. I watched from the shade of the maple tree as he demonstrated how to turn the small focusing ring, explaining with surprising seriousness that it would work best at night when the sky was dark enough to see Jupiter or Saturn. His enthusiasm drew a small crowd of children around him, and for a moment, the entire celebration revolved around that simple gift. Daniel eventually stepped closer to examine the telescope as well. He turned it in his hands with a thoughtful expression before handing it back to Lucas. "That is a pretty impressive present," he said, glancing briefly in my direction before looking away again. His tone was polite but cautious, as though he were unsure how much attention the moment should receive. Emily remained seated at the table, cutting another slice of cake for a guest while pretending not to notice the growing interest around Lucas. Her smile stayed in place, but it had become tighter around the edges. I recognized that expression because I had seen it before during other quiet family tensions. It was the look of someone who preferred to control every detail of a situation and did not enjoy surprises that shifted the focus elsewhere. After a while, the excitement around the telescope faded as children returned to their games across the yard. A group of them began chasing one another near the fence while Lucas carefully placed the telescope on the patio chair beside him. Emily clapped her hands again to gather everyone's attention. "All right," she said brightly. "It is time for the last activity before people start heading home." She walked toward a small box near the sliding glass door and pulled out several colorful party bags filled with candy and small toys. One by one, she handed them to the children while thanking them for coming to celebrate. The parents began gathering their belongings, collecting jackets, and calling their children together. The afternoon sun had shifted lower in the sky, casting longer shadows across the grass. I stepped forward slightly from beneath the tree, preparing to retrieve my purse from the chair near the patio. As I approached the table, I noticed something interesting. Several guests moved subtly to create space for me as I walked by, their gestures quiet but unmistakable. No one said anything aloud, yet their awareness of the situation had grown clearer as the afternoon progressed. Mark nodded politely as I passed him, and the woman who had smiled earlier offered another small look of kindness. These gestures were simple, but they reminded me that not everyone present had chosen to ignore what had happened. Emily finished distributing the last of the party bags and began stacking empty plates near the kitchen door. When she turned and saw me standing closer to the table again, her expression remained calm but watchful. "Did you enjoy the party?" she asked in a tone that sounded friendly on the surface, but carried a faint layer of curiosity beneath it. I met her gaze steadily. "Lucas certainly did," I replied gently. The answer seemed to satisfy her enough to end the exchange. She nodded once and returned to gathering decorations while guests began saying their goodbyes. Daniel walked the family toward the driveway, shaking hands and thanking them for coming. Lucas ran over to hug each of his friends before they left, his excitement still glowing on his face. When the yard began to grow quieter, he finally carried the telescope over to me again. "Grandma Margaret," he said eagerly, "will you help me look at the stars with this tonight?" His question was so hopeful that it softened something inside my chest. I knelt slightly, so we were eye level again. "Of course," I told him, "but you will need a clear sky and a little patience. The best things in the universe take time to appear." He nodded as if the answer made perfect sense, and then ran back to place the telescope safely inside the house. I straightened slowly and looked around the yard once more. Balloons drifted lazily along the fence. Paper plates were stacked neatly on the patio table. The celebration that had once filled the afternoon with noise and movement was slowly dissolving into quiet. Emily continued tidying the table while Daniel returned from the driveway, brushing crumbs from his hands. Neither of them spoke to me again as the final guests prepared to leave. Yet as I watched the last car pull away from the curb, the quiet decision that had begun forming earlier in the day settled firmly into place within my mind. Some lessons arrive gently, carried by ordinary moments that reveal truths we had once been unwilling to see. And once those truths become clear, they begin guiding the choices that come next. By the time the last car disappeared down the quiet street, the backyard had grown almost completely still. The balloons along the fence had begun to lose their energy, drifting gently against the wood as the evening breeze settled in. The table that had once been crowded with plates and laughter now held only a few empty cups and scattered crumbs of blue frosting. Emily carried a stack of plates toward the kitchen door without saying anything to me. Daniel gathered the folding chairs one by one and leaned them against the side of the house. Neither of them asked if I needed help or if I planned to stay longer. Their silence was not cruel in the loud way people sometimes imagine cruelty to be. Instead, it felt distant, like the quiet politeness reserved for someone who had slowly been moved outside the center of a family circle. Lucas ran out of the house again, holding the telescope, his excitement still glowing in his eyes. The evening sky above the neighborhood had begun to turn pale purple as the sun dipped lower behind the hills. "Grandma Margaret," he called eagerly, "the sky is getting darker. Does that mean we can see the stars soon?" I smiled gently at him and walked a few steps closer so he would not have to shout across the yard. "Not just yet," I said softly. "The stars take their time. They appear when the sky is ready." Lucas nodded with the serious understanding that children often give to simple wisdom. He placed the telescope carefully on the patio railing and began adjusting the small knobs the way I had shown him earlier. For several minutes, the two of us stood quietly beside the railing while he experimented with the lens. Daniel watched us briefly from across the yard, then turned his attention back to folding the last chair. Emily stepped outside again, carrying a small bag of leftover decorations. She paused for a moment when she noticed Lucas setting up the telescope. "Be careful with that," she said lightly. "It is probably delicate." Lucas looked up proudly. "Grandma Margaret gave it to me," he replied. Emily gave a small nod that was polite but restrained. "Well, make sure you do not drop it," she said before turning back toward the kitchen door. Her words were simple, yet something in her tone revealed that she had already moved past the moment earlier in the day, as if it had never existed. Perhaps that was easier for her. For a while, Lucas continued adjusting the telescope while I watched the sky deepen slowly above us. One by one, the first faint stars began to appear. Lucas gasped when he spotted the first one. "Look," he said excitedly, pointing upward. "There it is." I followed his finger and nodded. "That is how it begins," I told him quietly. "One small light, and then another." He leaned over the telescope again, trying to focus the lens on the growing points of light. His concentration was so intense that he barely noticed when Daniel approached us. My son stopped a few feet away, his hands resting in his pockets as he watched Lucas. For a moment, none of us spoke. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "The telescope was a thoughtful gift," he said in a careful voice. I met his eyes calmly. "Lucas enjoys looking at the sky," I replied. Daniel nodded once, but did not continue the conversation. After a few seconds, he turned and walked back toward the house where Emily was finishing the last of the cleanup. I watched him go with a quiet understanding. Sometimes people know exactly what should be said, but choose silence instead because it feels easier than facing the truth of a moment. Lucas finally stepped back from the telescope and looked up at me again. "When I grow up," he said thoughtfully, "I want to see all the planets." His dream was simple and bright, untouched by the complicated currents moving quietly between the adults around him. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder. "If you keep looking up," I told him softly, "you will always find something worth discovering." He smiled and returned to adjusting the telescope once more. After a while, I picked up my purse from the patio chair and walked slowly toward the driveway. The evening air had cooled slightly, carrying the soft scent of grass and distant pine trees. Behind me, Lucas continued pointing the telescope toward the sky while his parents moved quietly inside the house. As I reached my car, I paused for a moment and looked back at the yard. The maple tree stood tall beside the fence, its branches swaying gently against the darkening sky. Beneath it, the empty space, where the table had once been, seemed larger than it had earlier that afternoon. Yet instead of sadness, I felt a steady sense of calm. The day had shown me something important about the direction this family had taken. Understanding that truth did not change the love I felt for my grandson, but it did clarify the choices that would guide the days ahead. I opened the car door slowly and settled into the driver's seat. Through the windshield, I could still see Lucas standing proudly beside the telescope, searching the sky for the next star to appear. And as the first bright planet rose quietly above the horizon, I realized that sometimes the clearest view of the universe comes only after you step back far enough to see where you truly stand.